The desert was silent except for the hum of engines. A line of Italian M13-40 tanks moved slowly across the dunes, their thin armor glinting under the merciless sun. Inside, the crews sat in tense silence, sweat dripping onto metal floors, the smell of fuel thick in the air. Then, distant thunder. A low rumble rolled across the horizon. At first they thought it was artillery, but the sound grew steadier, deeper. Shapes emerged through the shimmering heat. They weren't British Grants. They were something new, bulkier, faster. The turrets turned smoothly, the long barrels locking with deadly precision. The Italian commander raised his binoculars and froze. "Sherman," he muttered. The name was already spreading through Allied ranks like a storm. The first American shells hit before the Italians could react. Armor cracked. Flames erupted. The desert filled with black smoke and shrapnel. Italian rounds bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's sloped fronts. Panic spread as machine guns tore through the sand, shredding what remained of the formation. When the smoke cleared, the desert was littered with burning hulks. In that moment, amid the roar of American engines, Italian tankers understood the truth. They were fighting a war their machines could no longer win. When Italy entered the Second World War on June 10, 1940, Benito Mussolini promised his people a new Roman Empire, one that would stretch across the Mediterranean, from the sands of Libya to the oil fields of the Middle East. In his mind, Italy was destined to stand beside Germany as a co-equal power, shaping the world in its image. But behind the speeches and parades, the truth was far less glorious. Italy was not ready for war. Its factories lacked modern machinery, its supply lines were fragile, and its armored forces, the pride of Mussolini's propaganda, were built more for show than for sustained combat. The Italian army entered the war with around 1,500 tanks, most of them light models like the L-335, a two-man vehicle armed only with machine guns. It was a relic of the 1930s, thinly armored, slow, and utterly unsuited for the open battlefields of North Africa. The first attempt to upgrade it produced the M11-39, a medium tank in name only. Its gun was mounted in the hull, not the turret, forcing the entire tank to turn just to aim. Still, Mussolini believed quantity would make up for quality. It didn't. When Italian forces under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani invaded Egypt from Libya in September 1940, they encountered the British Western Desert Force. Smaller, better trained, and equipped with the sturdy Matilda II infantry tank. The Matilda's armor was too thick for Italian guns to penetrate. Italian shells bounced off harmlessly, while British rounds sliced through the thin plates of the M11-39s. Within weeks, the Italian advance stalled, and then collapsed. The British counteroffensive, Operation Compass, in December 1940 was devastating. Nearly 130,000 Italian troops were captured. Hundreds of Italian tanks were destroyed or abandoned in the desert. What was meant to be Mussolini's first step toward empire had turned into national humiliation. But Hitler couldn't afford to let Italy collapse. In early 1941, he sent General Erwin Rommel and the newly formed Afrika Korps to stabilize the front. Alongside them, Italian armored divisions began to reorganize, among them the Ariete and Littorio divisions. These men would go on to fight some of the fiercest battles in the North African campaign. Italy's industry scrambled to improve its armor. The M13-40 emerged as the new workhorse of the Italian Armored Corps. It was a step forward. A turret-mounted 47mm gun, a four-man crew, and a diesel engine that gave it decent range. In 1941, it could still destroy British cruiser tanks and lightly armored vehicles. But even as it rolled off the assembly line, the world around it was already changing. The British introduced the Crusader tank, faster and better armed. Then came the Grant, an American-made tank with a 75mm gun that could destroy the M13-40 from over a kilometer away. Still, the Italian crews fought on. They had little choice. Despite their shortcomings, Italian tankers displayed remarkable discipline and courage under fire. In battles like Beta-Fam, Tobruk, and Bir el Gubi, they often held the line against superior forces. British reports after the engagements noted that Italian crews fought with determination, even when surrounded. But courage couldn't compensate for thin armor, poor radios, and unreliable mechanics. Inside an Italian tank, the conditions were brutal. The heat was suffocating, temperatures inside climbing above 50 tiers, 122 degrees. Dust clogged the engines. Vision was limited. Radios often failed, forcing crews to communicate with hand signals or flags. And when a hit came, the thin armor offered no protection. The tank often went up in flames, giving the crew only seconds to escape. Yet the men kept climbing into those machines. By mid-1942, Italian armored divisions were once again on the move. This time alongside Rommel's Afrika Korps in a renewed offensive toward Egypt. Spirits were high. Many believed victory was finally within reach. But in the distance, across the desert, a new sound was beginning to echo through Allied supply lines, the steady, confident rumble of the American M4 Sherman. It was the tank that would change everything. And soon, the Italian crews would meet it face to face. By the summer of 1942, the war in North Africa had become a contest of endurance. Both sides were stretched thin, fighting not only each other but the desert itself. Sandstorms shredded engines, heat warped steel, and every mile of advance came at a cost in oil, sweat, and men. For the Italian and German forces under Rommel's command, momentum still seemed to favor the Axis. The Ariete Armored Division, Italy's finest, had earned a hard-won reputation as a disciplined and reliable formation. Alongside the German 15th Panzer Division, it formed the backbone of Rommel's armored spearhead during his advance toward Egypt. But while the Italians were fighting with courage, the Allied war machine was evolving, fast. In early 1942, the United States entered the war fully, and its vast industrial power began to flood the Allied lines with equipment. The first American-made tanks, the M3 Grant, and later the M4 Sherman, began arriving in North Africa under the Lend-Lease program. These machines represented a leap forward in armored warfare. The M3 Grant, with its 75mm main gun mounted in the hull, was an awkward but powerful stopgap. It could knock out any Axis tank at long range, including the M1340 and even early Panzer IIIs. But it was the Sherman, appearing in combat later that year, that would redefine the battlefield. The Sherman wasn't invincible. It wasn't even the heaviest tank in the war. But it was everything the Italian machines were not. Reliable, well-armored, well-armed, and mass-produced in staggering numbers. Its sloped armor could deflect rounds that would have shattered older tanks. Its 75mm gun could penetrate Italian armor with ease. And most importantly, it worked. American engineers designed the Sherman not as an experimental marvel, but as a soldier's machine. Simple to maintain, easy to drive, and quick to repair. Crews could replace an engine in the field within hours. Spare parts were abundant. Logistics were efficient. In contrast, Italy's armored industry was struggling to keep up. The M1441, an upgraded version of the M13, featured a slightly improved engine and air filter, but retained the same outdated armor and gun. Its successor, the M1542, came too late and in too few numbers to make any difference. Italian production was crippled by resource shortages and Allied bombing. While the U.S. produced over 50,000 Sherman tanks, Italy barely managed a few hundred of its newer models before its factories were overrun. The industrial imbalance was staggering. But even beyond technology, doctrine played a crucial role. Italy's armored philosophy had been shaped by the First World War, a vision of tanks as infantry support weapons, not as independent strike forces. Italian tank divisions often operated under tight command structures, with limited coordination between armor, artillery, and air support. By contrast, the Allies, particularly the British and Americans, were learning to fight a combined arms war. Tanks advanced under cover of artillery and aircraft. Supported by mobile infantry and engineers, this difference in doctrine would prove catastrophic. By the time Rommel's forces reached El Alamein in the autumn of 1942, they were exhausted. Supplies were running out. Fuel convoys from Italy were being sunk by Allied aircraft and submarines in the Mediterranean. The Ariete Division's M13s and M14s were battered and worn. Many missing parts cannibalized from other tanks. Meanwhile, British and American forces were being reinforced daily. The 8th Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, was now equipped with hundreds of new Shermans. They trained relentlessly in the Egyptian desert, perfecting their coordination and gunnery. When the battle came, October 23, 1942, it would not just be a clash of men and machines. It would be the confrontation of two industrial worlds, one straining to survive, the other overflowing with material might. For the Italian tankers waiting in the dunes, their engines idling under the night sky, there was no way to know what was coming. They had fought bravely in the sands of Tobruk and Gazala. They had endured defeat and clawed back hope. But what was about to descend on them? The thunder of Allied artillery and the advance of hundreds of Shermans would break more than their lines. It would shatter their faith in their machines. The life of an Italian tanker was grueling long before bullets and shells arrived. Inside the cramped M1340 or M1441, 4 men shared barely enough space to move. The driver crouched low, legs cramped, hands on stiff pedals. The commander huddled above, binoculars pressed to his eyes, shouting orders that often went unheard. The gunner, shoulder against the 47mm cannon, waited for the single opportunity to fire, while the loader balanced ammunition in sweltering heat. Temperatures inside the tank could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees. Diesel fumes filled the cabin. Dust and sand infiltrated every crevice. Radios were rare or unreliable. Coordination depended on flags, shouted commands, or the luck of hearing your comrades over engine roar. Every decision had to be made under extreme physical stress, with fear pressing down like the desert sun. Yet the human spirit persisted. Reports from British intelligence frequently noted Italian crews' determination. Even when their tanks were immobilized or hit, many refused to abandon their posts. Some stood beside burning hulls to protect comrades. The human cost was high. Fatigue, heat stroke, and psychological strain compounded the danger of battle. Italian tankers were not naive. They knew the weaknesses of their machines. They saw British tanks shrug off their shells and, later, Shermans advancing with almost untouchable armor. Still, duty demanded they fight, and courage propelled them into impossible situations again and again. Italian tanks were born from ambition, not innovation. The M13-40 weighed 14 tons, armed with a 47mm gun, and had 30mm of frontal armor. Respectable in 1940, obsolete by 1942. The M1441 offered slightly better engines and marginal improvements, but it could not match the Sherman's speed, armor, or firepower. Shermans, by contrast, were medium tanks weighing 30 tons, with sloped armor and a 75mm main gun capable of destroying Italian tanks from over a kilometer away. Reliability was equally decisive. Italian tanks often broke down before reaching the battlefield. Engines overheated, tracks failed, and spares were scarce. American tanks rarely suffered similar mechanical failures. Even ammunition exposed weaknesses. The 47mm Italian shell could penetrate early British cruiser tanks at short range, but it bounced harmlessly off Shermans. Italian engineers tried to compensate with upgraded guns and improvised armor, but these fixes were insufficient against modern Allied armor. The technological gap was undeniable. Italian tanks could be brave. They could be tactically positioned. But when the Shermans appeared, victory depended not on skill, but on chance. Italian armored doctrine emphasized support rather than independent maneuver. Tanks were expected to accompany infantry and artillery, exploiting breakthroughs rather than creating them. In North Africa, this philosophy collided with the reality of mobile warfare. Communication was rudimentary. Most Italian tanks lacked radios. Units relied on flags, runners, or shouting. Orders were slow to travel, and once the battle began, situational awareness evaporated. Italian tanks often advanced blindly, separated from supporting infantry or artillery, while Shermans moved in coordinated platoons, covering one another with suppressive fire. At battles like Bir el Gubi, Italian units executed ambushes with limited success. Some M13s hid behind dunes, striking unsuspecting British tanks. But even small victories were fleeting. When Shermans arrived, American artillery and air reconnaissance neutralized Italian positions before they could capitalize on tactical advantages. The desert itself compounded the problem. Wide-open terrain favored speed and firepower. Italian tanks bogged down, while Shermans surged forward on wide tracks, maneuvering to exploit every gap. Each misstep was fatal. Italian commanders faced impossible choices. Generals like Baldassare or brigade leaders of the Ariete Division understood the limitations of their forces, but were ordered to hold lines or counterattack. Reports show repeated appeals for reinforcements and better equipment, often ignored or delayed by Rome. Commanders struggled with the mismatch between orders and reality. Some tried innovative tactics, flanking maneuvers, night attacks, or hidden ambushes. Others fought defensively, attempting to conserve limited tanks. Yet no strategy could overcome the technological inferiority and lack of coordination. Leadership became a test of human endurance rather than tactical mastery. Courage was demanded at every level, from high-ranking generals down to the men inside burning tanks, but it could not change the immutable facts of industrial disparity. Allied forces quickly learned to respect Italian tankers, even as they outclassed their machines. British and later American reports frequently described Italian crews as disciplined and determined. At Bir el Gubi, British officers noted that M13 tanks fought stubbornly, often holding positions beyond expectation. In Tunisia, U.S. reconnaissance reports recorded Italian crews engaging Shermans with unwavering resolve. Even when outgunned, this respect, however, did not translate into operational advantage for the Italians. Allied tank doctrine emphasized combined arms, tanks supported by infantry, artillery, and air cover, while Italian formations were isolated and vulnerable. Observers noted that Italian tanks often formed islands of resistance, cut off from reinforcements, and destroyed methodically. Shermans advanced with mechanical reliability, superior armor, and greater firepower. For Allied crews, encountering Italian armor was an exercise in caution, but not fear. The enemy could fight, but the machines were no match. Perhaps the most poignant angle of all was moral. Italian tankers faced an almost existential challenge. Fight in vehicles they knew were obsolete or surrender. Letters and diaries from survivors reveal a recurring theme. Pride and honor demanded engagement, even when defeat was inevitable. When M13 and M14 tanks rolled against Sherman formations in El Alamein and Tunisia, crews reported firing at ranges that offered no chance of penetration. Ammunition was wasted in futile gestures of defiance, and yet the men continued. The moral weight of duty, to comrades, to the army, and to Mussolini's orders, was heavier than fear. Survivors later described the sinking realization that industrial and technological gaps could not be bridged by courage alone. By the time the Sherman appeared on the horizon, it was clear. The Italian tank could not win in open battle against modern Allied armor. This moral collapse did not lead to cowardice. Instead, it forged a stoic endurance. Men learned to survive on skill, stealth, and cooperation, conserving what little advantage they could glean from terrain or tactics. Their legacy was one of persistence under impossible conditions, human spirit outlasting the machine's limitations. Repeated defeats exacted a toll on Italian tank crews. Desert campaigns were exhausting. Long patrols under scorching sun, scarce water, and relentless enemy pressure left crews physically and mentally drained. Fear was constant, but so was adaptation. Veterans describe improvising repairs under fire, jury-rigging fuel lines, and navigating treacherous terrain with minimal visibility. Each day tested the limits of endurance and ingenuity. Yet the psychological strain was compounded by witnessing American Shermans destroy Italian formations with apparent ease. Each encounter reinforced the inevitability of technological inferiority. Despite this, morale fluctuated. Small tactical successes, destroying a single Sherman or capturing an Allied supply truck, provided fleeting bursts of hope. But by 1943, in Tunisia, fatigue and hopelessness dominated. Crews realized that bravery alone could not compensate for inferior design, limited ammunition, and insufficient industrial backing. Italian armored doctrine failed to evolve rapidly enough to meet the changing realities of mechanized warfare. From the M1139 to the M15-42, incremental upgrades could not compensate for systemic flaws. Tanks were lightly armored, often lacking radios, and operated under rigid hierarchies. Commanders attempted to compensate with terrain use and defensive ambushes, but Sherman's and American tactics rendered these efforts largely ineffective. The lesson became unavoidable. Industrial and doctrinal limitations dictated outcomes more than individual heroism. This realization that their equipment and doctrine were hopelessly outmatched became the central truth of the Italian tank experience in North Africa. Every engagement reinforced it. Every destroyed M13, M14, or Semovente told the same story. Courage mattered, but it could not overcome industrial and technological disparity. The culmination of these angles, human endurance, technological inferiority, tactical rigidity, leadership constraints, Allied perception, moral weight, psychological strain, and doctrinal failure, sets the stage for the decisive turning point. The stage is ready. The desert horizon trembles with the roar of American engines, and the Italian tankers are about to face the ultimate test. The night was unusually still for the Egyptian desert. Italian tank crews of the Ariete Division huddled inside their M1340s, engines idling, sand sifting through open hatches. The darkness masked the desert's true danger. Across the horizon, the Allies were gathering strength. Hundreds of Shermans, Grants, and Crusaders, with artillery and aircraft poised to strike. For months, Rommel's forces had pushed east, advancing in fits and starts, relying on supply lines that were increasingly strained. Italian tankers had fought in Tobruk and Gazala, facing British Matildas and Grants, but nothing prepared them for the coordinated assault about to unfold. At dawn, the desert trembled. Artillery thundered first, shaking dunes and rattling tanks. Explosions tore the air. Then came the rumble of engines, steady, purposeful, unstoppable. American Shermans and British Crusaders surged forward, their 75mm guns trained, turrets swiveling with precision. Italian crews tried to respond. M13 guns fired, smoke curling from barrels. Some shells hit, mostly bouncing off thick Sherman armor. Others missed entirely, swallowed by dust and chaos. Communication was minimal. Radios failed in many tanks. Commanders resorted to hand signals, shouting over engines, trying to coordinate counterattacks. The Littorio Division attempted a flanking maneuver, hoping the dunes would provide cover. But the Allies anticipated it. Sherman tanks moved in platoons, mutually supporting each other. Any isolated Italian tank was quickly engaged and destroyed. By mid-morning, dozens of Italian tanks were ablaze. The heat and smoke made targeting nearly impossible, but the Shermans pressed forward relentlessly. Survivors of earlier engagements tried to regroup, but the desert had become a furnace of death. Italian officers, including Colonel Giuseppe Maris, made desperate decisions. They ordered counterattacks, hoping to slow the advance and protect retreating infantry. But the results were catastrophic. Armor was destroyed before reaching the enemy, crews abandoned vehicles, and morale plummeted. For the men inside the M13s, the realization was brutal. Their machines, once symbols of Italian pride, were now fragile coffins. Engines failed under fire. Tracks were torn off by mines and artillery. Visibility remained poor, and the desert sun compounded exhaustion. Each Sherman that appeared over the dunes confirmed what they had feared for months. The technological gap was insurmountable. Despite this, some crews fought with remarkable tenacity. In one sector, a small group of Ariete tanks delayed a Sherman platoon long enough for infantry to retreat. Smoke and fire consumed their vehicles. Men emerged shaken, scorched, but alive. Reports from British observers noted the extraordinary bravery of these crews, fighting against a hopeless enemy, refusing to surrender, and attempting to cover their comrades. By evening, the front lines had collapsed. The Allies had broken through, and Italian armored forces were scattered. Many M13s and M14s were abandoned, some burning, others immobilized in the sand. Survivors retreated under a relentless sun, weary, defeated, and confronted with the undeniable truth. Their tanks were hopelessly outmatched. The battle demonstrated more than just brute force. It revealed the consequences of industrial and technological disparity. Italian tankers had fought bravely, employed every tactic, and endured extreme conditions. Yet all of it was insufficient against a tank designed for the demands of modern, mechanized warfare. For Rommel, the destruction of Italian armor was a tactical concern, but also a strategic vulnerability. His supply lines relied on Italian cooperation, and the loss of tanks weakened Axis mobility. For the Allies, the engagement underscored the effectiveness of Sherman's and the growing dominance of U.S. industrial power on the battlefield. By the night of October 23rd, the desert was littered with wrecked Italian tanks. Smoke rose from the dunes. The sounds of engines had faded into silence. Survivors huddled in the shadows, listening to distant artillery and the occasional Sherman engine in pursuit. Exhaustion, fear, and the bitter taste of futility filled the air. Among them, one thought prevailed. Courage alone could not overcome steel and logistics. The next phase, retreat through Libya, Tunisia, and the eventual collapse of Italian armored divisions, would only confirm this grim reality. After the disaster at El Alamein, the remnants of Italy's armored divisions began a grueling retreat westward across Libya. The Ariete and Littorio divisions, once proud formations, were now shadows of their former selves. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were non-existent. M13 and M14 tanks, battered by shell fire and desert heat, struggled to move across sand that had already claimed so many vehicles. The retreat was relentless. Allied forces, now reinforced with American Shermans, pursued with speed and coordination. Italian tankers moved under constant threat of air attacks, artillery bombardments, and mechanized ambushes. Communication was almost impossible. Many units became separated. Small groups of tanks found themselves isolated, forced to fight alone or be destroyed. At Kasserine Pass, Italian M15-42 tanks attempted to support German forces against advancing U.S. troops. The M15-42 was slightly faster, better armed, and marginally more armored than the M13-40, yet it was still no match for the Shermans and Grant tanks arrayed against it. Italian gunners fired repeatedly, but their 47mm and 75mm guns could not penetrate the frontal armor of the Shermans. Mechanics worked feverishly under fire to repair engines, tracks, and weaponry, but many tanks simply could not be saved. Crews abandoned vehicles in the desert, some setting fires to prevent capture. Each destroyed tank marked a bitter confirmation. Italy's armored forces were obsolete in the face of American and British industrial might. Despite these losses, Italian crews displayed remarkable resilience. Small units of Ariete veterans conducted delaying actions, using the desert terrain to ambush Shermans, destroy supply trucks, or hold key crossroads for hours. These actions, while tactically limited, allowed German units to regroup or retreat with fewer casualties. However, the human cost was staggering. Survivors reported exhaustion beyond comprehension. Rations were minimal. The desert heat combined with sleep deprivation and constant combat produced a fragile mental state. Yet courage remained. Tankers knew their machines could not win, but abandoning them without a fight would have been unthinkable. They persisted until forced to flee or witness destruction firsthand. By mid-1943, the Italian Armored Corps in North Africa had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Units were scattered, tanks destroyed or captured, and industrial support had collapsed. Factories in Italy, previously producing M13 42s and Semovente self-propelled guns, had been bombed or occupied by German forces. Mussolini's promise of a powerful Italian armored presence in Africa had ended in ruin. Even after the Italian surrender in September 1943, remnants of armored units continued to resist in pockets. Some crews joined partisan groups, sabotaging railways or ambushing German convoys in northern Italy. Others aligned with the Allies, using surviving Semoventes to support British and American infantry during the campaign through southern Italy. Yet these were isolated acts of valor, not coordinated military operations. The lesson was inescapable. Italian tankers had fought with discipline, courage, and ingenuity, but the industrial and technological reality had doomed them. The Shermans were not just stronger, faster, and more reliable. They represented a logistical and doctrinal system that Italy could not match. Bravery alone could not bridge this divide. For those who survived, the experience left a permanent mark. Diaries and memoirs recount a bitter mix of pride and despair. They were proud of their personal courage and cohesion under fire, but painfully aware that no amount of bravery could compensate for obsolescence and underproduction. The desert campaigns of 1942-43 were a crucible. They revealed the truth about Italian armored forces. Honorable, competent crews trapped in machines that were hopelessly outmatched. When historians analyze North Africa, El Alamein, and Tunisia, the focus often falls on Rommel, Montgomery, and Sherman tanks. But the story of the Italian tankers, the human spirit tested against insurmountable odds, remains a poignant, instructive chapter. Their fight was valiant, their defeat inevitable, and their lessons enduring. The end of the Italian armored divisions in Africa set the stage for the post-war reflection on courage, technology, and the human cost of industrial imbalance in modern warfare. By the end of May 1943, the North African campaign had concluded. The Axis forces, including the remaining Italian armored divisions, were defeated. Italy had lost nearly all of its tanks, and the survivors had been captured, destroyed, or abandoned in the desert. The Ariete division, once the pride of the Italian Armored Corps, had ceased to exist as an effective unit. The numbers were staggering. Of the roughly 1,500 tanks that Italy had deployed to North Africa over the course of the campaign, fewer than a few dozen remained operational by the final battles in Tunisia. Thousands of men were killed, wounded, or captured. The deserts of Libya and Tunisia became a graveyard of metal and men. Smoking M13s, charred Semoventes, and the occasional intact Sherman marking the shift in armored dominance. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. Axis supply lines had been severed. Rommel's forces, already stretched thin, could no longer maneuver effectively. The Allies gained full control over Egypt and Libya, securing the Mediterranean coast and access to vital oil supplies. The destruction of Italian armored formations had demonstrated clearly that courage and tactical ingenuity could not substitute for industrial capacity and technological superiority. The Italian tankers who survived the campaign returned home to a country under strain. Italy had suffered repeated defeats in Greece, North Africa, and the Balkans. Morale was low. The collapse of armored divisions in Africa became a symbol of Italy's broader military shortcomings. Poor industrial planning, outdated equipment, and overambitious strategic goals. Reports from Allied forces reinforced these lessons. British and American officers consistently noted the discipline and bravery of Italian crews, even in hopeless situations. One U.S. after-action report from Tunisia observed, "The Italian tank crews fought with persistence and skill, despite the overwhelming firepower of our Sherman units. Their machines were hopelessly inferior, yet their resolve was remarkable." Yet recognition of valor did not translate into results on the battlefield. Italian tankers had endured fire and destruction, but the larger structural problems, lack of modern equipment, insufficient numbers, poor logistics, ensured that their sacrifices could not alter the outcome. At home, propaganda had once painted armored divisions as symbols of Italian strength and ingenuity. Now, newsreels and reports could not conceal the truth. Italian tanks had been systematically outclassed by Allied armor. The M13-40 and M14-41, which had been hailed as modern machines in 1940, were now relics of a bygone era. The losses also had a psychological impact on the survivors. Letters and diaries from returning tankers describe a mixture of shame, frustration, and paradoxically, pride. Pride in their personal courage. Frustration at the inability of their machines to survive against Shermans. Shame at witnessing the destruction of divisions they had trained and fought with for years. Industrial and doctrinal lessons became unavoidable. Italy's tank factories, Fiat, Ansaldo, and Breda, had struggled to produce even a fraction of the vehicles needed. Designs that were adequate in 1940 could not keep pace with the rapid evolution of Allied armor. By the end of the campaign, the stark contrast between Italy's limited production and the mass-produced Sherman became a central lesson in military planning. The aftermath in North Africa was also instructive for the Allies. The engagement demonstrated that morale and bravery could not compensate for technological disparity. Shermans, well coordinated with infantry and artillery, proved the effectiveness of modern combined arms warfare. The destruction of Italian armor highlighted the importance of industrial scale, mechanical reliability, and logistical planning. Lessons that would resonate throughout the European and Pacific theaters. Despite the devastation, Italian tankers remained a human story. They had endured impossible conditions, desert heat, mechanical failures, ammunition shortages, and overwhelming enemy fire. And even in defeat, many refused to surrender without fighting. Their resolve, though unable to change the strategic outcome, left a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. Allied officers, historians, and post-war analysts alike. The North African campaign closed with Italian armored divisions effectively annihilated. Their defeat signaled the end of Italy's ambition for independent armored warfare in Africa, forcing the nation to rely on German command and equipment for the remainder of the war. The stage was set for the final chapter, the collapse of Italy's armored capability in Europe, the lessons carried by veterans, and the post-war reflection on what it had meant to fight in hopeless machines with undying courage. As 1943 progressed, Italian armored forces faced a reality they could no longer ignore. The North African campaign had stripped Italy of nearly all its operational tanks, and the survivors were scattered across Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. Many were captured by the Allies, others abandoned in the desert to be salvaged or destroyed. The once proud divisions, Ariete, Littorio, and elements of the Trento division had effectively ceased to exist. The collapse in Africa coincided with political upheaval at home. Mussolini's regime was faltering, and the military's failures reflected broader systemic weaknesses. Armored divisions had been Italy's symbols of modernity and strength, yet their destruction exposed the limits of Italian industrial capacity. Factories could not keep pace with the war. Spare parts were scarce, and tank designs remained outdated compared to Sherman production lines, churning out hundreds per month. Surviving Italian tankers faced difficult choices. Some joined German units in North Africa or Italy, operating Panzer IVs or flak-equipped semoventes under German command. Others aligned with the Allies after the Armistice of Cassabile in September 1943, using captured equipment to fight against German occupation. These transitions underscored a stark truth. Italian armor had lost autonomy, and its crews had no choice but to adapt to survive. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of men were killed, wounded, or captured. Diaries, letters, and post-war interviews reveal a recurring sentiment. A mixture of pride in their personal courage and frustration at being equipped with machines they knew were inferior. Tankers recounted ambushes, futile exchanges with Shermans, and the agonizing sight of comrades burning inside thinly armored M13s. These experiences left an enduring psychological scar, shaping post-war perceptions of Italy's armored campaigns. From a strategic perspective, the aftermath confirmed the supremacy of Allied industrial power. Shermans, well supported by artillery, air power, and mechanized infantry, had demonstrated that quantity, reliability, and doctrine outweighed courage and individual skill. Italian tankers' bravery could not bridge the technological and logistical gap. The desert battles highlighted how industrial output directly determined the effectiveness of armored warfare, a lesson that would resonate across Europe. Historians analyzing these campaigns often emphasize numbers and machines. Yet the Italian tankers' story adds nuance. Their efforts reveal that modern warfare is not solely about technology, but also about human endurance, adaptation, and the capacity to confront hopeless odds. The men of Ariete and Littorio fought, despite knowing their tanks were outclassed, a testament to discipline and courage under fire. The legacy of Italian armored divisions in Africa persisted beyond the battlefield. Veterans returned to Italy with stories of valor and defeat, influencing post-war military analysis and popular memory. The destruction of their formations underscored the consequences of inadequate preparation, underfunded production, and outdated doctrine. More broadly, it highlighted the harsh reality of industrialized warfare. Nations with superior production, technology, and logistical systems could dominate even the most courageous opponents. In the end, Italian tankers had fulfilled their duty with honor. They fought bravely against overwhelming odds, yet the outcome was inevitable. Their experience became a cautionary tale, a story of human spirit confronting mechanical and strategic inferiority. As the desert fell silent, and Allied forces consolidated control over North Africa, one truth remained undeniable. The era of Italy's independent armored warfare in Africa had ended. The lessons learned about courage, technological disparity, and the human cost of industrial imbalance would resonate long after the smoke of battle cleared. The final chapter beckons, a reflection on what these events meant for history, for humanity, and for the legacy of those who fought in hopeless machines with unwavering courage. The story of Italian tankers in North Africa is not merely a tale of machines and battles. It is a meditation on courage, industrial disparity, and the unforgiving nature of modern warfare. In the scorching deserts of Libya and Tunisia, men climbed into tanks they knew were obsolete, facing Shermans that could annihilate their vehicles from distances they could barely reach. Yet they fought. They adapted, endured, and resisted. Not because victory was likely, but because duty, honor, and survival demanded it. Their defeat was inevitable, dictated by factors beyond human control. Inadequate production, outdated designs, and limited logistical support. The M13-40, M14-41, and even the later M15-42 could not compete with the Shermans, which combined reliability, firepower, and mass production to dominate the battlefield. The Italian experience highlights a stark lesson of industrialized warfare. Courage and valor, while essential, cannot replace technological parity and strategic preparation. Yet within this defeat lies a profound human truth. Italian tankers displayed an extraordinary combination of bravery and resilience. They fought under brutal conditions, searing heat, mechanical failure, and relentless enemy fire, and still carried out their duties with discipline. Survivors carried memories of comrades, scorched metal, and empty desert battlefields, reminders of the personal cost of being outmatched by machines as much as by strategy. Historically, the clash between Italian armor and the Sherman is a microcosm of World War II. War II itself, a conflict where industrial capacity, logistics, and technology increasingly determined outcomes. But the human element, the courage of crews, the bonds forged in impossible situations, the willingness to confront overwhelming odds, remains central to the story. The Italian tanker's experience endures as both a cautionary tale and a tribute. It reminds us that warfare is as much about the machines and numbers as it is about the men inside them. And even in the shadow of inevitable defeat, human courage and perseverance shine through, leaving a legacy that outlasts the burning metal of their tanks. In the end, the desert did not merely consume machines. It revealed the limits of ambition, the weight of technological disparity, and the enduring spirit of those who fought, knowing the odds were against them. Their story is one of resolve in the face of hopelessness, a lesson in both history and humanity.